For today's program, I began with recollections written by my great-granduncle about his grandfather and his father and their migration to the Midwest. I located 4 other stories here in our library collections, and Lorna Lincoln has added a story from her family. And thank you to Dave Wallace for reading 2 of these stories today. I hope the stories encourage you to search for them in your own family and to appreciate the courage, bravery, and sacrifice our ancestors made to settle this country. I'm going to share the screen. And now we can do the first. Yeah, you can sit here because then they'll see your lovely picture up there.
All right. So I'm going to be reading from Isaac Kramer's A Prairie Almanac. This is from detailing from New Geneva, Pennsylvania to Iowa. He said the great financial crisis of 1837 occurred about the time I first attended school. All business came to a standstill. Businessmen with debts were ruined, my father among them. Consequently, over the next few years, a great exodus took place to new and unsettled parts of the country. Men sought claims where they could build cabins and occupy the land until the opportunity for buying it occurred. My 48-year-old father was completely broken up. He went to Iowa for a visit in the summer of 1843. The first person he met on Iowa soil was a man who had been an employee at the glass factory, Jim Beatty. Jimmy took father to his home about 10 miles away. From there, father went on foot to Lynn County, about a 50-mile walk. He located a claim in the eastern part of the county. The area would be known as Lynn Grove. On his return trip, he stopped in Ohio and asked his oldest son, Lewis, to precede us next summer. Lewis would take his family and team, build a cabin, and occupy the claim. Father started for Iowa the following September, traveling with his wife and 6 children in a keelboat named Star. The boat was comparatively long and narrow. Its low freight deck, although covered, was not high enough for a person to stand in upright. Its steering oar had a paddle on the end and was attached to the stern of the boat. An iron bolt served as a pivot. The paddle could be raised from or lowered into the water as needed. The helmsman stood or sat where he could watch both fore and aft and guide the boat. Pike poles pushed the boat along when it could not be floated or had to go upstream. These poles had steel points that could be thrust into the riverbed. A crosspiece on the upper end afforded a pushing point to make the boat move forward. A runway on either side of the boat deck was outfitted with nailed-down cross pieces for bracing the feet while pushing. So oarsmen stepped from brace to brace until they got to the afterdeck. Then each went back with his pole and repeated the process. Then he talks about how at Pittsburgh, the Kramer keelboat entered the Ohio River and began its float past Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois on the right, and West Virginia and Kentucky on their left. On the Ohio, we met with many dangers between Pittsburgh and Cincinnati. Father decided to abandon the Star, leaving it for sale at Cincinnati. He took passage on a steamer for the 2 families to continue. However, our progress was little better than we had made on the keelboat. The river was so low that hardly a day passed when we were not stuck fast on some sandbar. We spent 2 or 3 days on the Cumberland bar. To relieve our hunger, our parents obtained a little flour that produced some of the best bread I ever ate. Mother mixed the flour with river water and baked it on coals. The boat entered the Mississippi River at Cairo, Illinois, continuing northward past St. Louis and as far as the steamboat could go. At Keokuk, Iowa, some in our party walked 12 miles along the Mississippi to the head of the rapids. We who were unable to walk that distance rode on an open flatboat along the boxed household goods. Arriving at Montrose, we lodged overnight in the barracks of a long log building. The next day, the steamer came and took us from Montrose to our landing place in the Iowa Territory. I did find that Montrose still exists and has a population of about 700 people. But it's directly across the river from Nauvoo, Illinois.
This next story was taken from a Solon newspaper in 1905 of the account of James Monroe Adams's experiences of crossing the plains to prospect for gold in California. The voice of James Monroe Adams. I look back and think of the number of people who crossed in the early times, most of them in the prime of life, so few of them are left. It makes me feel lonely. People going to California now know nothing of the hardships that trip meant, especially to women and children. We had them in our company nearly all the way through. There were 3 young men of us, had 1 wagon, 1 yoke of oxen, 3 yoke of oxen, and a mule to ride. Each wagon was provided with from 3 to 5 yoke of oxen, and some had a yoke of cows to provide milk. Our wagons were loaded with essentials for the inner man, enough we thought to carry through the trip. We took along hardtack, bacon, and beans, formed the principal part of the groceries of dried fruit. Our provisions were stored in the wagon bed. The top of the box was decked over with boards laid crosswise. That was for our bed and bedding. We had a sheet iron stove with an oven so we could make biscuits. We left home on the 3rd of May on our long journey. The west part of Iowa was very thinly settled, the houses being 10 miles apart in places. There were few bridges, and how do you pronounce that?
Sloughs.
And the sloughs were tramped up knee-deep for rods up and down. We fed our cattle for 2 or 3 days. After that, they got their own living. We were just 2 weeks going from Iowa City to the Missouri River at Council Bluffs. Before we got to Council Bluffs, we were met by some begging Indians, each with a paper with writing on. One said, "This is Chief so-and-so, give him something." One handed us a paper. It read, "This is a mean Indian, don't give him anything unless you have a poor dog." To them, a fat dog pleased them very much. A squaw came along carrying on her back a big fat dog. The head, tail, and feet had been cut off. When the boys laughed and said dog, she got very angry and said buckskin, meaning deer. Now the party is in Utah. Our camp so far had been lively, 2 violins, singing, and occasionally dancing. In crossing here, we came to the grave of the first cholera victims. As we came into camp, 3 wagons were just ready to start out. They said 3 men, 1 from each of the 3 wagons, were alive at 11 o'clock and had since died and were buried. The widow of one lingered a few minutes by the grave, then climbed into her wagon and followed the other 2. No violins were brought out that night, and our camp was rather quiet for the following 2 weeks. A few were frightened and wanted to turn back. The captain's wife said, "No, we are going on or die in the attempt." We passed many fresh graves in the next 2 weeks. One Cedar County man, Snyder by name, one day passed a wagon by the side of the road. The men were digging a grave, and he asked if anyone was dead. They answered, not quite, but they wanted the grave ready so that they could go right on as soon as he was buried. Can you get up here, Lorna? You just hit it when it goes to the picture of all of them.
Okay. I'm talking today about Bessie Elizabeth Lincoln and what she wrote probably about 5 years before she died. Coming to Iowa from Michigan with her family and what she remembered about her grandparents who were the immigrant ancestors. And she wrote this in January of 1964. Grandpa, William George Lincoln, was born in 1815 in Abbottsley, England, and died in Stanley, Iowa, December 26, 1894, at Jonathan and Eveline Lincoln's home in Stanley. Jonathan was William's son. Elizabeth Hines Lincoln, his wife, was born April 1815 in England and died in Jackson County, Michigan, on March 10, 1879. They came to the United States in 1851, taking what was supposed to be enough for the trip. Bad weather, slow going, the people on board came near starving before they could land. They settled in Ohio for a time and then went near Springport. Grandma was ailing for years. Grandpa George Novus was born in England in 1816 and died in Jackson County, Michigan. In 1888, Sylvia Novus was born in England in 1826 and died in 1904. They raised 9 children, 6 girls, Esther, Carolyn, Francilia, Eveline, my mother, Helen, and Belle. 3 boys, Louis and Wren, and Mortimer, who died when he was around 21 years old. Grandpa and Grandma had a hard life. Ma went back to take care of both of them at death. Grandpa had cancer. He suffered terrible. He was a cabinet maker in England. The old bureau I have, he made for Ma. If the old finish was taken off and refinished, it would be really lovely. I've always thought I'd do it, but lacked the ambition, I guess. I, Bessie Bates, was born August 15, 1879. Then in May 1885, we all came to Olwine, Iowa, then headed 5 miles north. We had gone about 1 mile, and then there were no roads, and we headed across country through creeks, ditches, and over stone to Scott Center. Anne carried Pearl, who was born April 20th, a few weeks before, on a pillow. It took Ma to keep Jack and I from falling under the wheels. It was a terrible trip out there where we landed. Grandpa and Will came on ahead and was already there. All there was were 3 small rooms. Will, Grandpa in one room, Ma, Pa, and Pearl in the little pantry, and Anne, Jack, and I on the floor in the kitchen. The one place that Ma could put Jack and I that we didn't fall off of. Grandpa was the only one in his family. There was a family of 2 girls and 2 boys, half relatives, and Aunt Cal Sherman, Frank Sherman's mother. Pa and Ma Lincoln. Jonathan Hines Lincoln was born at St. Neots, Huntingdonshire, England, 12 miles from Cambridge, on September 3, 1839. He married Eveline Novus on October 12, 1867. She was born February 1, 1850, in Jackson County, Michigan, near Springport. Will, Anna, Jack, Pearl, and I were all born in Jackson County, Michigan. Roads were awful, no bridges. We drove through if we could, otherwise went around. There was no Chicago Great Western Railroad. We went on the Rock Island. They were building the Presbyterian Church that summer at Stanley. Buildings on the place was a 3-room house with a cellar under it, 1 row of willow trees west of the house and then east to the corn cribs. There was an orchard down from the willows, about on a line east of the house. A walkout northwest of the house got a good airing. There were strawberries, raspberries, currants, gooseberries, grapes, and rhubarb around the willows and the garden spot. Evergreens in front and a dug well that caved. George Bennett dug a new well that I believe is in use now and put up a Perkins windmill. Pa and Grandpa Bill made the tank and put up a milk stand. I remember all that. Can't remember the greenery. There was an old barn about where the horse barn is. I can remember the pig house going up and them hauling timbers from Cornhill. Pa would take 2 teams and wagon and go before daylight. Usually some neighbors would go along. How Ma and Grandpa Bill would worry about them on those hills with those long timbers. I can remember them framing those timbers, but can't remember them raising the barn. Hick Miller and Wilbur Clark were there helping. Ma and I took the sticks that fastened the bunch of shingles together and laid out a walkway to the walkout because it was so wet to get there. We took the 2x2 pieces off the end of the rafters and fixed flower beds. I can't remember where the chicken house was, but we had eggs and chickens. Can't remember either barn going up. The addition on the house must have been the first year. It was cold when Pa was casing and put a little door to go to the attic over the kitchen. I was helping Pa and sawed into my thumb. Scared to death, Pa picked me up and commenced yelling, "Ev, come quick, I've cut the child's hand off." Ma and Grandpa Bill doctored it up, as I remember, with mutton tallow. That thumb is a thick, horrid looker with a rough nail. Pa would go to work on Monday morning and be gone all week, but always home to help with the hard work. I can see him now in a red and black checked shirt with the neck open and the sleeves rolled up in the haymow and straw pile, thrashing with horses on a merry-go-round and a tumbling rod. Ma had warned us about it being dangerous and to keep away. You know, my mother was a wonderful woman. Pa didn't have a chance, what with always being away working. Ma was our dependence. We always went to her, and it had to hurt Pa. I am sorry for any part I had. Ma was outside helping Will and Grandpa Bill doing a man's work. They did well, for I was only 12 when we went to Stanley. I can remember when they got the hay loader, I drove horses for the loader and fork, and Jack was on the rake. Pearl was on a pillow with Ann caring for her while doing the housework. Jack had hard luck, and I think about it so much. He wore copper-toe boots. Climbing up the corn crib, he fell and struck his arm on the wheel of the wagon and broke it bad, splintering a hole in his arm. Ma and Grandpa Bill doctored it, laid his arm on the table, and they twisted into the hole to get a piece of bone out. Can't think that Jack ever whimpered and was so long getting well. This is where our good neighbors came in. Eli Bird lived north somewhere, when we could get across the creek near where Clyde lives now. There were no bridges and quite a bank. He stopped for Jack. He had straw in the bottom and a high box behind. I can see Ma and Grandpa Bill get them ready. They put Will's overcoat on Jack and covered him all up, and then Mr. Bird took them to Dr. Patterson and brought them home. He couldn't put them on the spring seat. They couldn't stay there because it was too rough. Will had a spell when he had a team of horses pulling a stone boat coming downhill from the road and over a deep culvert into the yard. He tried to slow the team to make the turn and pulled on the lines. Then the boat would go over the horses' heels and they'd jump. Will went off and the boat went over him. His legs from the knees down were awful but not broke. Then Ma and Grandpa Bill were doctors again. Ma took care of all 4 of their parents when they got sick and died. Grandpa and Grandma and us lived together. When Grandpa Novus died, Ma, Pa, and Pearl went back to Michigan for a long time. I stayed with Edith and Frank Sherman. Ann cooked for Grandpa and took care of the rest. Grandpa Bill was Uncle Bill to everyone else. Grandpa Novus came to Iowa once when we were on the farm. The railroad was in Stanley then. Pa was working there and he borrowed Wilbur Clark's gray horse and go-kart and brought Grandma out home. I was at school and saw them go by. Aunt Cal Hines Sherman was born in England and was Grandma Elizabeth Hines Lincoln's sister. Her husband, Matt Sherman, died young. They had 3 children. George Sherman married and had 1 or 2 children and died young. Alice Sherman married Charlie Gamm and had 1 child. Frank and Edith are the ones I knew here. They were married and fixed up a covered wagon. They lived and slept in it and drove a team of gray horses from Jackson County, Michigan near Springport through to the old home at Scotts Center, Iowa. They landed here on July 4th, just before dark. We saw them coming way down before they got here, had a little black dog alongside the team of horses. They bought the George Ben place of 80 acres, and they built the place up and must have done well there. Up to the time we moved to Stanley, I used to be there a lot. Aunt Cal came to be with Frank and Edith after their baby died. They were also down with us. That's all I have.
Thank you, Lorna. Oops, next to me. The next story was written by my great-grand-uncle. In his grandfather, Seth Sampson #1, and his father, this Seth Sampson #2. So my short first story is about my 3 times great-grandfather, who was born near Boston in 1778. In the year 1816, he took himself and family and all his belongings to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, traveling doubtless by covered wagon drawn by oxen over the fingers and toes of the Alleghenies. There he bought and built a houseboat for the journey down the river. 2 weeks more or less of drifting with the current brought him to the wharf at Cincinnati. On the way, he had fallen in with General William Henry Harrison on a houseboat with a family, wife, and 8 children like his own. The general, wearing his laurels recently won at Tippecanoe, was a national character, and my grandfather was always proud of his 2 weeks' acquaintance and association with that great man. The general halted at Cincinnati, the end of his journey. My grandfather was always glad to tell of their parting, receiving from the general a quantity of supplies: flour, bacon, potatoes, and more. The general would accept no pay for them, saying, "I do not need them. You are going farther. I can get plenty here." I mention this as an example of the universal spirit of the pioneers: fraternity, brotherly kindness, goodwill, and practical help without expecting any recompense. A system of almost pure socialism in practice with the name. The next story is about my 2 times great-grandfather, Seth II. So he set out in 1853 in February and March on the river by steamboat. We changed boats at Louisville and again at St. Louis. These changes took time. Travel was not then what it is now. So we were near 3 weeks making the journey by Iowa, where we landed and proceeded by horse-drawn wagon about 40 miles to Van Buren County. Near Birmingham, where we lived for 1 year, during which Father did a little prospecting for a place to make a permanent house. He found a tract of 80 acres, unopened government land in Wapello County, about 4 or 5 miles northwest of Birmingham. He had secured for $100 or $125 per acre. 50 years later, on Monday, November 23rd, just today, 1863, we left this place for a new house 75 miles away in Decatur County. Father, mother, and 6 children, ages from 2 years to 13. I was at the time 11 years old, the second of the bunch. It is easy to recall the picture: the covered wagon, mother and the 4 little ones inside, horse team, 1 extra horse led behind, father, brother Ed, and myself on foot bringing up the rear, driving our small herd of stock, 10 sheep and 6 cattle. We started about 10 a.m. We halted by special gracious invitation at the home of one of the old neighbors 2 miles away from our old home to have a last meal, a kind of a farewell dinner. This was a kind of custom in vogue among the pioneers, to give departing friends a good send-off. The day was fine, sunshine, mild temperatures, but before the night a sudden change gave us a bleak sky and decided chill. Father sniffed the air and looked about and overhead, scenting trouble. We stopped for the night at a comfortable farmhouse near Kirkville, a village about 8 miles from our starting place. This was the first lap of our journey. The people permitted us to carry our own bedding inside, to camp on the floor. I recall distinctly the comfort and good cheer of that place, especially the open fire in the grate, stacked high with Iowa coal. I resolved that if I should ever have a home of my own, one of its features should be an open grate in the living room.
His testimonial coming from West Wilson. He said, in Scotland, the farming class was mostly on rented land. The game of the country was protected by law and gameskeepers. The farmers and renters didn't take kindly to these games laws or gameskeepers. They considered them unfair laws, mostly for the benefit of the sporting rich, and they would shoot this game when they thought they could do so without getting caught at it. This kind of shooting was called poaching. Wes Wilson, my father, liked to poach, and so did a lot of the other young fellows in the country liked to poach. They considered it great sport to slip onto some of the estates, shoot game, get the gamekeepers after them, and then to make their getaway. And while in some cases the gamekeepers thought they knew who the poachers were, the law required that they would have to be caught on the premises with the evidence at hand. Otherwise, they couldn't be arrested and fined. Father had made his arrangements to come to America, and on the night before the day he was to sail, there was some kind of a celebration taking place in their neighborhood. And to add cheer and light to the occasion, they had a bonfire going. There had also been a new gamekeeper appointed in their district, and he was going around in the crowd making boasts and threats, how he was going to catch these poachers and what he would do to them. These boasts and threats were more or less directed at Father and got him riled up. And being a powerful man, he grabbed hold of the gamekeeper and threw him into the bonfire. It didn't do the gamekeeper much damage, only that it singed off his whiskers. But that was a more serious offense than poaching and could call for arrest and punishment. But before they got around to make up their minds what to do about it, if anything, Father had sailed for America, and that was the way he said goodbye to Scotland. We arrived at New London, Connecticut in 1846, rented some land, raised and sold vegetables, bought some lumber. He carried on in these industries for several years, but the lure of the West was with him, and in 1854, he came out here to Tama County and filed on land, then went back to Connecticut and settled his affairs there, then came back again in 1856 to stay. In getting located on his land, he discovered that the land he had, according to description, he had wasn't the land that he had actually looked at. The land he had looked at and what he thought he was getting was down by Gilbert McDowell's and Stark's, but it all looked alike. Nobody knew where towns would ever be, so rather than bother making any changes, he accepted what he had, according to description, and had settled for. A little later, surveyors came along checking corners, and when they got to his land, he was on hand with a hammer and cold chisel and carved a letter W on the side of the stone that was closest to his land. A like stone was set at each corner of the farm. In the meantime, he had built his house, and for a barn, he plowed the prairie and lifted the sod and built sod walls. He then laid long poles across the top of the walls, put brush crossways on the poles, and with his scythe, cut the prairie grass and put it on top of the brush for a roof. He brought his gun over with him. Game was plentiful here, but one day in coming back from hunting, he laid the gun down, saying, "There's no sport in it. There are no gamekeepers here." And strange to say, he never cared much for hunting afterwards.
So in another book in our library, I located a poem that was anonymously written. It's titled Pioneering. There wasn't any architect, no banker made a loan to solve the housing problem. They were strictly on their own. They didn't buy didn't sign a mortgage, and they didn't buy a lot. Just stopped the covered wagon at a likely looking spot. No lumber yards were running. They cut timber from prairies and hills and hewed it into beams and joists and boards and windowsills. They had to hand saw every plank and quarry every stone. But finally they got it done, a home to call their own. No mansion, but a sturdy house, built their own strong hands had made. It stood on fertile acres that had never been surveyed. No warranty, no abstract fee, no red tape legal fuss. They just came out and built the West and left the rest to us. Our last story is from Etta Wilson. This story was printed in one of our society newsletters in December of 1965. This woman had written her autobiography, but she passed away before it was finished, but they published what she had written. And she graduated from Coe and was a teacher and is buried in Oak Hill. I was born in the autumn of 1862 and old enough to remember some of the early days following the mustering out of the troops, the friendly Indians that camped in our vicinity, and the beggars. Our doors were always open to all who drew largely upon our resources. How many times I remember giving up our beds to some homeless wanderer, and when morning came was followed by the boiling and washing of all bedding used by the dirty and sometimes infected transient. But no stranger was ever turned away without help if needed. My father and mother, each from homes of luxury and ease in early life, forced into the hardships of pioneering life through no fault of their own, were hardworking, self-sacrificing individuals. Around us were ragged, untutored beggars and Indians, of which we children were always afraid, and whom we were taught to try to help. How many times we little tots huddled around mother to watch her putting our food and sometimes our clothing to others, while we listened to the tale of another's woe. And if a night's lodging was asked, it was usually granted. I especially remember one old woman with mother filling her sack with bread, vegetables, and meat, while I wondered what we would have left to eat. Her story was of a sick husband and children, and she repeated her visits. One time the Indians camped on our land. We children cautiously watched them just over the hill, then saw 2 or 3 come toward us begging for food, mother giving from the garden and larder. As mother said, Indians would not hurt us. And in the evening, after a hard day's work, he and mother took us to see the camp. They were very friendly and were preparing their evening meal in a large iron kettle hung over an open fire. We children left their camp with the impression that they were preparing dog meat and sometimes cooked snakes for their food. Many times we had such contact with Indians, though usually they camped a little further away from our house. Besides the Indians, we were often worried by white beggars and tramps. On one occasion, I counted 98 men who passed our door in one day, tramps from Cox's army. I also remember another earlier time when in the busy season of the year, our beds were given to others, while mother, father, and we 3 children slept or tried to sleep on straw ticks on the floor. The night was warm and stifling, the moon shining full. I was restless, and long after the others were asleep, I was startled by someone touching the bed where I lay as he went by to a window. He stood looking cautiously around, then passed out of the house, doubtless with too much pity to steal from us. Another time when we were away from the house, we found on returning that the house had been ransacked and all the pennies from the little banks which we children cherished were gone. But with all the disappointments and worry, we were a happy, usually carefree family in ordinary good health, always surrounded by worthwhile friends and ready to do our part in looking after the unfortunates. And that's all we have. Let's see. So I hope this, lights please. Yeah. So I hope this inspires you to look for stories or to recall maybe some stories that you heard your grandparents tell.
I was telling Ruth that this guy that I read about, he is buried at Oak Shade. His wife is in Oak Shade. His parents are at Robbins Cemetery. But I found in March 1st, Cedar Rapids Gazette, Mr. Kramer's obituary, and I put it in with his final grade report. Born in 1832, died in 1923. So it has actually a much more thorough account. In fact, Ruth told me that we actually have a book.
Right above your head, Linda.
I wondered.
Yeah.
I thought that was the same book.
Yeah, a Prairie Almanac, a whole book of his stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Because it seems like he and his wife ran a florist shop. And I think when I moved to Cedar Rapids around 1980, in that 300 block of 3rd Avenue, right next to that theater, there was Lakes Florists. And I think that's where the Kramers ran their greenhouse for a long time.
And the story from James Monroe Adams from the Solon newspaper was actually in the Johnston genealogy boxes, I believe, that were donated to us by a family. So you might go looking and find something. Anybody on Zoom have anything to say? Go ahead and unmute and talk if you want to.
Well, I'll chime in here. I was fortunate enough with my late husband to visit the Gen Society in your wonderful library. he passed away about 7 years ago, but I'm still on the track of finding out more about his family. His grandfather was the first elected fire chief, and a younger brother was a long-time policeman in Cedar Rapids. But I've kind of come up against a fence of trying to track people who came out of Ireland. How many Thomas Cooks do you suppose left Ireland?
Yeah.
But anyway, they are the first two graves uptown in the Catholic cemetery. His great-grandparents are. And the cemeteries are sort of littered with various of their children, of whom there were 10. And then relatives, people they married into. So someday I want to get back to your library and keep on looking. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm going to stop the recording. We can visit. Okay.